On Monday of this week, we read a great book about Mrs. Spitzer's garden, and it was a wonderful extended metaphor about teachers and how they plant seeds, and you've had an opportunity to thank a teacher. We want to take this a step further and think about how every one of us, because of our positive and high expectations for Whittemore Park, can make a difference. I want to read a little book to you today called Wanda's Roses. We're staying in that flower theme, but this is a little different story. It's called Wanda's Roses by Pat Brisson, illustrated by Marianne Coca Leffler, and it's a great little story of faith against the odds. I think it's an underdog story, which kind of fits our theme of Whittemore Park, how we're rising to be champions, okay? So I just want you to listen this morning and think about the message of optimism, of positive thinking that we see in this book, Wanda's Roses. One morning in May, on the way to school, Wanda noticed a bush growing in the empty corner lot at Fillmore and Hudson Streets. It must have been growing for a while because it was about 2 feet tall. And Wanda was surprised she hadn't noticed it before. But there it was, bare and thorny. And Wanda, who loved beautiful things, felt her heart beat faster. A rose bush, she said to herself, my very own rose bush. Now, the rose bush didn't really belong to Wanda, but since nobody seemed to own the lot or the heaps of junk that were piled there, she decided she would care for this bush and make it her own. All during school, she thought about her rose bush. During art, she drew pictures of what it would look like in bloom. During library, she borrowed books on arranging flowers. During science, she asked so many questions about how to take care of it that finally her teacher said she really must stop asking questions about roses, start thinking about electricity, which was what the lesson was about. After school, she rushed to the rose bush. It was still bare and thorny. Maybe it needs some more sun, thought Wanda, so she put down her school bag and began dragging some of the nearby trash out to the curb. Mrs. Turner, who was on her way to the store, stopped to help her with a broken chair. Cleaning up the neighborhood, Wanda? Mrs. Turner asked. That's a nice project for you. Oh, I'm not just cleaning, Wanda told her. I'm helping my rose bush to get more sun so it will bloom. Your rose bush? Mrs. Turner asked. Where is your rose bush? Over there, Wanda said, pointing proudly to the bare, thorny bush. Oh, Wanda, I'm not so sure that's a rose bush, Mrs. Turner said gently. Sure it is, said Wanda. I've seen rose bushes in books, and this is what they look like before they bloom. You just wait. In a few weeks, this lot will be full of roses. Well, said Miss Turner, shaking her head. Good luck with it, Wanda. As she walked away, Mrs. Turner thought to herself, if that's a rose bush, then I'm the Queen of England. The next day after school, Wanda hurried to her rose bush. It was still bare and thorny. Maybe it needs more air, thought Wanda. So she put down her school bag and began taking more of the trash out to the curb. Once I get all of this trash out of here, nothing will block the air from getting to my rose bush, Wanda thought. Mr. Claudel was on his way home from work and saw Wanda trying to drag an old door, and he stopped to help. Cleaning up the neighborhood, are you, Wanda? He asked. Not just cleaning, Mr. Claudel, Wanda told him. I'm getting rid of this trash so my rose bush will get more air. A rose bush? Here? Mr. Claudel asked, and so Wanda showed him the rose bush. I don't know much about gardening, Wanda, Mr. Claudel said, frowning, but I don't think that's a rose bush. Sure it is, said Wanda, and in a few weeks this lot will be filled with the sweetest smelling roses you ever saw. She thanked Mr. Claudel for his help and went off to drag away some more trash. Mr. Claudel shook his head. If that's a rose bush, he said to himself, then I'm the King of France. Every day after school that week and the next, Wanda worked in the empty lot. Mrs. Giamatti, who lived in an apartment next door, gave Wanda trash bags for the old shoes, beer bottles, broken toys, and bits of glass that she was picking up. You've done a great job of cleaning up the lot, Wanda, Mrs. Giamatti told her. Oh, I'm not just cleaning, Wanda said. I have to get rid of this trash so my rose bush will get enough sun and fresh air to bloom. Where is your rose bush? Mrs. Giamatti asked. So, Wanda showed her. Mrs. Giamatti put her hand on Wanda's shoulder and spoke softly to her. Wanda, she said, "This is not a rose bush." "Oh, but it is," Wanda said. "And in a few weeks, this lot will be filled with the most beautiful roses you have ever seen." "Well, that would be nice," said Mrs. Giamatti, "but I don't want you to be disappointed if this bush doesn't bloom." "Don't worry, Mrs. Giamatti," Wanda answered. "I won't be disappointed." Mrs. Giamatti sighed. "That is not a rose bush and will never be one," she thought to herself. Next week, when the rose bush still wasn't blooming, Wanda talked to her school librarian. "I need some books about getting roses to bloom," she told Mrs. Jones. "Oh, do you have a rose bush, Wanda?" Mrs. Jones asked. "Yes, but it doesn't have flowers yet, and I know it has enough sun and fresh air." "Does it have enough water?" Miss Jones asked. "Water," Wanda said. "Of course. That will make it bloom." That afternoon, she hurried to the rose bush. It was still bare and thorny. She looked at the dry ground and smiled. "Don't worry, little bush," she said out loud. "I'll get you some water, and then you'll be able to grow flowers." Wanda went to the butcher shop across the street. "Mr. Sanchez, would you please give me some water for my rose bush?" "Rose bush? Is that what I see you taking care of and talking to every day over there?" "Are you sure that's a rose bush, Wanda?" Mr. Sanchez asked. "Oh, yes, I'm sure," Wanda said, "but it can't bloom because it needs water." Mr. Sanchez gave her water in a plastic bucket. "I hope that really is a rose bush, Wanda," he said, looking at her doubtfully. "You'll see," Wanda told him. "In a few weeks, that whole lot will be full of roses." As Wanda carried the water to her rose bush, Mr. Sanchez muttered, "In a few weeks, that thorn bush will still be a thorn bush." Every day, Wanda ran to her rose bush after school, but every day it was still bare and thorny. She watered it and sang to it and checked its bare branches for roses. Mr. Claudel, on his way home from work, stopped by to see if there were any roses yet. Mrs. Turner, on her way to the butcher shop, stopped to see if there were any roses yet. Mrs. Giamatti, seeing Wanda in the lot, called down from her apartment to ask if there were any roses yet. When Wanda went to the library at school, Miss Jones asked if there were any roses yet. And every day, when Wanda went to the butcher shop for water, Mr. Sanchez asked if there were any roses yet. To each person, Wanda would answer the same thing. "Just you wait. Pretty soon this whole lot will be filled with roses." And then one day in June, Wanda had an idea. Looking at the bare thorny bush, she said, "If my rose bush won't give roses to me, I'll just have to give roses to my rose bush." When she saw Mrs. Turner, Mr. Claudel, Mrs. Giamatti, Miss Jones, and Mr. Sanchez, she gave each of them an invitation that said, "Please come for tea and muffins in Wanda's rose garden, Saturday morning at 9. "Oh dear," said Mrs. Turner, "is she still expecting to get roses from that bush?" "Oh no," said Mr. Claudel, "and she's worked so hard too." "Oh my," said Mrs. Giamatti, "she'll be so disappointed." "Oh darn," said Mr. Sanchez, "there must be something I can do." "Oh good," said Miss Jones, who had only heard about the bush from Wanda and hadn't seen it for herself. "And I'll bring the muffins." The night before the tea party, everyone was very busy. And the next morning at 9, everyone was surprised to see Wanda's rose bush covered with roses. Paper roses that Wanda had made herself and carefully tied to each bare, thorny branch. But more surprising yet, everyone who came to the party had brought along a rose bush to plant near Wanda's, except Miss Jones, who had brought delicious blueberry muffins. After they had eaten their muffins and drunk their tea, they all got busy planting rose bushes. Mr. Claudel and Mrs. Turner dug the holes. Mrs. Giamatti held the bushes in place, while Wanda and Miss Jones filled in around the roots with soil, and Mr. Sanchez brought water from his shop and watered them all thoroughly. When the work was finished, Mr. Claudel said, "Wanda, this is going to be a rose garden fit for a king." "Or a queen," said Mrs. Turner. Wanda and the others smiled. And later that summer, the whole lot was filled with the biggest, most beautiful, sweetest smelling roses that anyone had ever seen, just as Wanda had always said it would be. Now, as I read this wonderful story about Wanda's roses, I think about so many things. I think back to the fall when we read Seed Folks, about a little girl that kicked off a cleaning frenzy to make their neighborhood beautiful. So I want you to, as we finish and we close out the video, I want you to talk about that. What connections, text to text, do you see between Seed Folks and this particular book? The other thing I noticed is that one of the things we did at Whittemore Park this year was to plant roses out front. And it's taken all year, but now we have beautiful roses blooming. The place here has become more beautiful, just as you have become more beautiful throughout the year. Talk about that little analogy. The other thing I think is one of the most powerful things to talk about with this book is the power of positive thinking. Wanda never stopped believing that her rose bush would produce something beautiful. She continued to believe with her wonderful optimistic spirit that if she didn't give up, that something would change. And did it change? Oh, yes, it did. Because others heard her joy and her excitement, and they came together as a community to make sure that Wanda's roses really did bloom. And I think about what we do every day at Whittemore Park as a school community. Teachers and staff and children working together to make this place bloom. I want you to have some rich conversation about this today. And then tomorrow we're going to do something really special to reach out to another school that's in need and that we might want to plant some rose bushes, so to speak, with another school. Thank you for listening. I hope you've loved this book as much as I do, Wanda's Roses. Thanks.